Kent, England, winter 1603. Snow falls across a house that refuses to be simple. 7 courtyards, 52 staircases, 365 rooms, one for every day of the year, though no one who lived there ever needed that particular symbolism explained. The architecture doesn't whisper, it announces. 4 acres under one roof. Stone the color of old bone, mullioned windows catching weak winter light, chimneys rising like a small city's skyline. The numbers tell one story, the reality tells another. Knole House was never meant to be a private home. It began as an archbishop's palace in the 1450s, grew through centuries of religious and political upheaval, and eventually landed in the hands of a family who would hold it for over 400 years. The Sackvilles. Their story, and Knowle's, is one of survival, adaptation, and the grinding arithmetic of maintaining something too large to love and too valuable to abandon. This is not a story about building a dream. Knole was already built when the Sackvilles acquired it in 1603, a gift from Queen Elizabeth I to Thomas Sackville, her cousin and Lord Treasurer. What follows is something more complicated. The story of inheriting a monument, living inside history, and discovering that castles don't care about the people who occupy them. The house had its own demands. The house always won. If you enjoy deep investigations into English country houses and the families who inherited impossible architecture, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which estate to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. The story begins not with construction, but with acquisition, with a gift that was also a burden, with a house that had already consumed centuries and would consume centuries more. Thomas Sackville became the first Earl of Dorset in 1904, and with that title came Knole, a palace that would define and confine his descendants for generations. To understand what Knole cost, you have to understand what it demanded, not just money, loyalty, identity, the slow erosion of choice. Let's begin.
Thomas Sackville did not build Knole House. That matters more than it seems. He was born in 1336, the son of a cousin to Anne Boleyn, which meant royal blood ran close enough to matter, but distant enough to survive. His family had wealth. His father, Richard Sackville, was known as Phil Sack for his success in enriching the family coffers through shrewd management of confiscated monastery lands during the dissolution. Thomas grew up understanding that proximity to power was dangerous and useful in equal measure. He became a lawyer, then a diplomat, then a poet. His contribution to The Mirror for Magistrates earned him literary respect, and finally, a statesman. By 1599, Queen Elizabeth I appointed him Lord Treasurer of England, one of the most powerful positions in the realm. He managed the crown's finances during England's war with Spain, navigated the complexities of an aging queen's final years, and survived the transition to James I in 1903 without losing his head or his position. The Queen gave him Knole in 1903, shortly before her death. It was a reward for service. It was also a test. The house was already ancient by Thomas Sackville's time. Archbishop Thomas Bourchier had built the core structure starting around 1456. Subsequent archbishops expanded it. Henry VIII seized it in 1538 during the dissolution of the monasteries. The king had a talent for taking what he wanted and calling it reformation. For 65 years, Knole remained crown property, used occasionally by royalty, but mostly empty, a monument without purpose. When Thomas Sackville received Knole, he was 67 years old. Most men of his era were dead by that age. He had perhaps 5 years left, though he didn't know it. The house he inherited was not a blank canvas. It was a finished monument to ecclesiastical power, built on the scale that bishops and archbishops had commanded, designed to awe and intimidate. 7 courtyards connected by passages and staircases, the Great Hall, the Gatehouse, the Elizabethan Chapel. 52 staircases, one for each week of the year, 365 rooms. The symbolism was already there, the calendar house, as if living inside a year would make time more manageable. Thomas Sackville began renovations immediately, not because Knole needed improvement, though it did, but because taking possession of such a house required making it yours. He added the Venetian ambassador's bedroom, expanded private apartments, installed new plasterwork ceilings decorated with Sackville heraldry. The work was expensive. Costs are imprecise, but estimates suggest thousands of pounds, money that came from his position as Lord Treasurer and from family estates. He worked quickly. By 1608, much of the renovation was complete. He never saw the full realization of his vision. On April 19, 1908, Thomas Sackville collapsed and died during a meeting of the Privy Council at Whitehall. He was 71. The cause was likely a stroke or heart attack. The records say only that he fell from his chair and died within minutes. His body was brought back to Knole and buried in the family chapel at Withyham. His son, Robert Sackville, inherited everything: the title, 2nd Earl of Dorset, the estates, the debts, and Knole, now a Sackville house bearing Sackville crests, filled with Sackville ambitions. Robert was 35 years old. He had been raised for this. He was not ready.
Robert Sackville, 2nd Earl of Dorset, lived at Knole for the next 2 decades. What he felt about the house is recorded only in his actions. He kept it, he maintained it, he did not expand it significantly. That restraint tells its own story. The wound that drove Robert was not personal rejection or social exclusion. It was debt. His father had left the family wealthier than before, but Knole itself was a financial sinkhole. The operating costs, staff salaries, repairs, heating, provisions, consumed thousands of pounds annually. Robert's income came primarily from agricultural rents on Sackville estates scattered across Kent and Sussex. In good years, the income covered expenses. In bad years, it didn't. Robert managed. He was not a spendthrift like some of his aristocratic peers. He kept household accounts, monitored expenditures, and made practical decisions. When repairs were needed, he authorized them. When they could wait, they waited. This was not glory. This was stewardship. But there was another pressure. Robert and his wife, Lady Anne Clifford, had one daughter, Margaret. No son. In aristocratic inheritance, this was a problem. Without a male heir, the title and entailed estates, including Knole, would pass to Robert's younger brother, Edward. Margaret would inherit only what was not entailed, which was far less. The marriage was not happy. Anne Clifford was herself an heiress to vast northern estates, but those estates were disputed. Her father's will had left everything to Anne and her sister, but male relatives challenged the inheritance, arguing that the estates should pass through the male line. Anne fought for her rights for decades, keeping meticulous diaries that survive today as some of the most detailed records of aristocratic life in Jacobean England. At Knole, Anne felt like a prisoner. The house was magnificent. The house was also a cage. She described it later as a place of discontent and sadness. She wanted her own estates in the north. Robert wanted her to give up the fight and accept what they had: Knole, security, the life of a countess. The argument consumed years. Anne eventually left Knole, returning to her northern estates when Robert died in 1909. Their daughter, Margaret, was 5 years old. Wait, that date is wrong. Robert Sackville died in 1909, just 1 year after his father. He was 36. The cause, typhoid fever, or another sudden illness that swept through England that year. He had held Knole for barely 12 months. The title passed to his brother, Edward Sackville, who became the 3rd Earl of Dorset. Edward was 31, unmarried, and entirely unprepared to manage an estate the size of Knole. But he learned. Edward Sackville, 3rd Earl of Dorset, lived at Knole for over 30 years. He was the first of the family to truly inhabit the house, to shape it not through renovation but through use. What Knole became under Edward was not an archbishop's palace or a royal gift, but a functioning aristocratic household. And that transformation required something the house had never possessed in such concentration: people. Edward married in 1612. His wife, Mary Curzon, was the daughter of a baron and brought a modest dowry. They had children, 4 sons and 1 daughter who survived infancy, and with each birth the household grew. Not just family, but staff, nurses, tutors, ladies' maids, valets, footmen, grooms, cooks, scullery maids, gardeners, gamekeepers. Dozens of people, then scores, then over 100. By the 1620s, Knole was fully operational. The Great Hall hosted dinners for local gentry and visiting dignitaries. The Venetian ambassador's bedroom saw actual ambassadors. The chapel held services twice daily. The deer park, over 1,000 acres, was stocked with herds that required constant management. The kitchens, located in the basement beneath the Great Hall, operated with military precision, producing meals for family, guests, and staff. Edward was not a shy man. He had killed a man in a duel in 1613, Lord Bruce, over a matter of honor that the historical record describes vaguely, and though he was acquitted, the incident marked him as someone not to be crossed. At Knole, he ruled with similar authority. He was generous when it suited him, cold when it didn't. Surviving letters show him negotiating with stewards over accounts, disciplining servants, managing family disputes with precision. He was also a patron of the arts. Ben Jonson visited Knole and wrote verses in Edward's honor. Musicians performed in the Great Hall. The library grew with volumes purchased from London booksellers. Edward understood that a house like Knole was not just shelter, it was performance. Every guest who arrived saw the scale and understood the message. The Sackvilles had power. But power cost money. Edward's annual income from estates was substantial. Estimates suggest around £6,000 to £8,000 per year, which would be roughly $1.2 to $1.6 million today, adjusting for inflation and purchasing power. Knowle's operating costs consumed perhaps $3,000 to $4,000 of that. Repairs, expansions, and maintaining multiple estates ate more. What remained was enough to live comfortably, but not extravagantly. Edward was wealthy by any standard except comparison to the greatest nobles of England, and at Knole, comparison was unavoidable. The house demanded attention. Roofs leaked, stone cracked, wood rotted, textiles wore out. Every generation faced the same arithmetic. The cost of maintaining Knole exceeded the emotional or social return. But selling was unthinkable. Abandoning the house would mean abandoning status, history, identity. The Sackvilles were of Knole. Knole was of the Sackvilles. Edward died in 1652 at the age of 74. He had survived civil war, the execution of Charles I, and the establishment of the Commonwealth under Cromwell. He had kept Knole through it all. His son, Richard, inherited next. Richard was 48, a royalist who had fought for the king and lost. He held Knole for only 5 years before dying in 1677 at age 53. The pattern was set. Each generation inherited the house, maintained the house, and passed it to the next. The house outlasted them all. By the late 17th century, Knole House had been in Sackville hands for nearly 70 years. The structure was complete. No major construction remained. What followed was operation, not creation, and operation required machinery, human machinery. The household staff at Knole in the 1670s numbered around 60 to 70 people during normal times, swelling to over 100 during major events or hunting season. These were not servants in the abstract. They had names, ages, wages, lives. The household account books survive in the Sackville family archive, held at the Center for Kentish Studies, and they record details with bureaucratic precision. The hierarchy was rigid. At the top, the steward, who managed the estate's finances and reported directly to the earl. Beneath him, the housekeeper, responsible for female staff and household supplies. Then came upper servants, the butler, who managed wine cellars and dining service, the head groom, who oversaw stables and transportation, the head gardener, who maintained the grounds. Middle ranks included ladies' maids, valets, footmen, housemaids, kitchen staff. At the bottom, scullery maids, hall boys, stable hands, teenagers doing the dirtiest work for the lowest wages. Wages varied by position and era, but records from the 1680s provide specifics. The steward earned around £40 per year, plus accommodation, food, and often additional benefits like clothing allowances. A footman earned £8 to £12 per year. A housemaid earned £5 to £6. A scullery maid earned £3 to £4. These figures seem small, but context changes everything. Agricultural laborers in Kent earned roughly £10 to £15 per year for back-breaking outdoor work. Domestic service at a great house like Knole offered slightly better pay, year-round employment, accommodation, and food, significant advantages. But the work was relentless. A day at Knole began long before the family woke. 4:30 in the morning, 5 at the latest. Kitchen maids lit the coal ranges, massive iron structures that heated ovens and water for the entire day's cooking. Scullery maids hauled water, despite Knole having wells and limited plumbing. Housemaids moved through reception rooms, cleaning grates, laying fresh fires in dozens of fireplaces, dusting furniture that had been dusted yesterday and would be dusted tomorrow. The house had to be fully awake and functioning before anyone upstairs opened their eyes. Fires burning in bedrooms before the family rose, hot water ready for washing, breakfast prepared in the kitchens ready to be carried upstairs the moment it was called for. The performance began before dawn and continued until the family retired, usually near midnight. Between those hours, constant motion. Beds made, chambers emptied, laundry scrubbed, floors swept, silver polished, boots cleaned, horses groomed, meals cooked and served and cleaned up after. 3 meals daily for the family and guests, breakfast, dinner in the early afternoon, supper in the evening, plus separate meals for upper servants and lower servants. The kitchens operated nearly 20 hours a day.
Step past the Great Hall, and the other face appears. Behind the beauty lies infrastructure. Knole's service areas occupy the ground floor and basement, hidden from guests by design. Separate staircases, narrow, steep, unadorned, allowed servants to move through the house without being seen. These stairs connect to service corridors that run parallel to main passages, creating a second circulatory system. Staff used these arteries to carry supplies, remove waste, and respond to calls without disturbing the family or guests. The kitchens sprawled across the basement beneath the Great Hall. Multiple rooms, one for roasting meat on open hearths, one for baking bread and pastries, one for preparing vegetables, one for washing dishes. The heat in summer was brutal. Open fires burned constantly. Stone walls held the warmth. Ventilation was minimal. Accounts from servants describe fainting from heat exhaustion during large dinners. Adjacent to the kitchens, the scullery, where the filthiest work happened. Scullery maids scrubbed pots, cleaned grease from roasting pans, washed vegetables pulled from the garden still covered in dirt. Their hands cracked from lye soap, their backs ached from bending over stone sinks. They were usually 14 to 16 years old. The service corridors were painted dull gray or institutional green, lit by small windows or eventually gas lamps and eventually bare electric bulbs. The contrast with upstairs, gilded ceilings, tapestries, carved wood paneling, was deliberate. The house had 2 faces. Guests saw one, servants lived the other. Accommodations for staff varied by rank. Upper servants, butler, housekeeper, head groom, had private rooms, small but their own. Middle-rank servants shared rooms, 2 or 3 to a chamber. Lower servants slept in attics or basement dormitories, sometimes 6 or 8 to a room, in beds that were little more than straw mattresses on wooden frames. Privacy was a luxury reserved for those who served most closely. Meals for servants were taken in the servants' hall, a large room in the service wing. Upper servants ate separately in a smaller room with better food and more privacy. The hierarchy extended even to eating. Lower servants ate simple fare, bread, cheese, porridge, occasionally meat, while upper servants received meals closer to what the family ate, though never quite as fine. The bell system controlled movement. Every major room in the family quarters had a bell pull, a cord connected by wires and springs to bells mounted on a board in the servants' corridor. When someone upstairs pulled the cord, a corresponding bell jingled below. Each bell had a distinct tone.
Experienced staff could identify the calling room by sound alone. When a bell rang, somebody moved immediately. The family and their guests did not wait. A delay of more than a minute or two could mean reprimand. Repeated delays could mean dismissal. And dismissal from a great house like Knole meant losing not just wages, but accommodation, food, and the reference needed to secure future employment. The bell system was not cruel in intent, it was simply efficient. The house demanded constant responsiveness. Servants provided it.
The hierarchy below stairs at Knole was as rigid as the aristocratic hierarchy above. Everyone knew their place. Crossing a boundary meant consequences, social, professional, sometimes physical. At the top of the servant hierarchy, the steward and housekeeper. The steward, always male, managed the estate's finances, oversaw male staff, and served as the earl's direct representative in household matters. By the late 17th century, Knole's steward earned approximately £40 to £50 per year, plus substantial benefits, private accommodation, meals at the upper servants' table, allowances for clothing and travel. He dressed in dark suits, spoke with authority, and wielded power over hiring and dismissals. The housekeeper, always female, managed female staff, oversaw household supplies, and controlled access to storerooms where valuable items, linens, china, preserves, tea, sugar, were kept under lock and key. Her wages were similar to the steward's. She wore black dresses with a chatelaine at her waist, a decorative belt holding keys that symbolized her authority. She was called Mrs. regardless of marital status, a mark of respect. Just beneath them, personal servants. Ladies' maids attended the countess and adult daughters, helping them dress, styling their hair, maintaining their wardrobes. Valets performed similar duties for the earl and sons. These positions required skill and discretion. Ladies' maids earned £12 to £20 per year. Valets earned slightly more, £15 to £25. They traveled with the family, saw private moments, kept secrets.
Below personal servants, footmen and housemaids. Footmen served at table, answered the door, carried messages, accompanied the family on outings. They wore livery, matching uniforms in Sackville colors, and were often chosen for height and appearance. Wages, £8 to £12 per year. Housemaids cleaned chambers, made beds, emptied chamber pots, maintained fires. Wages, £5 to £7 per year. The work was invisible. If done well, no one noticed. If done poorly, dismissal followed. Kitchen staff formed their own hierarchy. The head cook, usually male in great houses, commanded a kitchen like a general. Under him, sous chefs, pastry cooks, roasting cooks, kitchen maids who prepared vegetables and assisted. The kitchen operated on military discipline. Meals had to be perfect and on time. Mistakes meant verbal abuse, sometimes physical. Burn the roast, ruin the sauce, serve a dish cold, consequences were immediate. Stable staff managed horses, carriages, and outdoor equipment. The head groom earned £15 to £20 per year. Undergrooms and stable boys earned £5 to £8. They rose before dawn to feed and groom horses, maintained tack, cleaned stables. The work was physically demanding, often outdoors in harsh weather. But for boys from agricultural families, it was a step up from farm labor. At the very bottom, scullery maids and hall boys. Scullery maids scrubbed pots, washed dishes, cleaned kitchen floors. Hall boys carried coal, hauled water, ran errands, emptied chamber pots. They earned £3 to £5 per year. They were often 14 to 16 years old, from poor families, grateful for any work. Their hands bled from lye and cold water. Their backs bent from lifting. They were invisible to everyone except the cook or housekeeper who directed them. The system was not randomly cruel. It was structurally efficient. Knole required constant labor to function, 50 to 70 people working 12 to 16 hours daily. The hierarchy ensured that labor happened without the family needing to manage details. Orders flowed down from steward and housekeeper to upper servants to lower servants. Everyone had a role, everyone knew their place. The machine ran. What the servants actually thought of the Sackville family is only partly visible. Letters are rare. Most servants were literate enough to read instructions but not practiced in writing personal correspondence. Diaries are almost non-existent. What survives are household account books, employment records, occasional mentions in family letters, and very rare first-hand accounts from servants who wrote memoirs later in life. Put together, they form a complicated picture. By the standards of the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the Sackville family treated staff relatively well. Wages were competitive. Payments came regularly, important as some aristocratic families fell months behind. Dismissals, when they occurred, usually came with notice and references. There are no records of unusual cruelty, of servants beaten or starved or abused in ways that would have prompted legal action even in that era. But kindness from a position of total control is still a form of control. The Sackville family had absolute authority over employment, accommodation, and reputation. A servant dismissed without a reference had almost no chance of employment elsewhere. Fear of dismissal meant compliance. Compliance meant the system functioned smoothly. Some servants stayed at Knole for decades. The account books show names appearing year after year. John Peacock, groom, employed from 1685 to 1712. Mary Runnels, housemaid, employed from 1792 to 1718. Long tenure suggests acceptable conditions, perhaps even loyalty. But it also suggests limited options. Where else would a middle-aged housemaid go? The awareness of difference never disappeared. Servants ate in the servants' hall while the family dined upstairs on silver plate. Servants slept in attics while the family occupied bedrooms with fireplaces and tapestries. Servants worked 12-hour days while the family pursued leisure, hunting, reading, entertaining guests. The house had two worlds, separated by function and class. A gentle master is still a master. A generous employer still holds all the power. The Sackville family was not unusual in this. They operated within the system of their time. But the system itself was built on extraction, labor from servants, rent from tenants, status from display. The magnificence of Knole rested on foundations most visitors never saw. While staff worked below, the performance continued above. Knole, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, functioned as a center of regional power. The Earl of Dorset held significant influence in Kent. He appointed local officials, influenced elections, dispensed patronage. Knole was where that power was displayed. Guests arrived regularly. Local gentry came for dinners. Members of Parliament visited during election seasons, seeking support. Relatives arrived for weeks-long stays. The house accommodated them all. The Venetian ambassador's bedrooms saw actual diplomats. The king's room hosted royalty. Charles II visited in the 1660s, cementing the Sackville family's return to favor after the Restoration. A typical weekend house party involved 20 to 40 guests. They arrived Friday afternoon in carriages. Servants unloaded luggage, showed guests to chambers, unpacked trunks. Dinner that evening in the Great Hall. Multiple courses, roasted meats, elaborate pastries, wine from the cellars. Conversation, cards, music. Guests retired near midnight. Saturday brought activities, hunting in the deer park, walking the gardens, reading in the library. Dinner again, another elaborate performance. Sunday, chapel service in the morning, more leisure, departure after tea. For guests, a pleasant weekend in the country. For staff, 3 days of non-stop labor, preparing rooms, serving meals, cleaning up, laundering linens, then preparing for the next set of guests. The Great Hall itself deserves detail. Built in the 15th century, it remains one of the finest examples of medieval domestic architecture in England. The ceiling soars 40 feet. The screen passage at one end, carved oak, separates the hall from service areas. At the other end, a dais where the family sat, elevated above guests. The walls are hung with tapestries and armor. A massive fireplace dominates one wall. It could burn logs 6 feet long. But the Great Hall was also cold. Even with fires roaring, the volume of air was too great to heat effectively. Guests in winter wore heavy coats indoors. Servants standing along the walls during dinners shivered for hours. The grandeur was real. The discomfort was also real. Knole's library grew substantially under Charles Sackville, the 6th Earl of Dorset, who inherited in 1677. Charles was a poet, patron of the arts, and friend to writers including John Dryden and Matthew Prior. He collected books obsessively: first editions, rare manuscripts, volumes on architecture and travel and natural philosophy. By his death in 1606, the library held over 3,000 volumes, making it one of the finest private collections in England. He also collected furniture. Knole today holds one of the most important collections of 17th-century English furniture in the world: chairs, tables, beds, cabinets, because Charles purchased or commissioned pieces and kept meticulous records. The famous Knole settee, a deep sofa with adjustable sides, was likely made for the house in the 1640s and survives in near-perfect condition. But Charles also accumulated debt. The cost of maintaining Knole, purchasing art and books, entertaining lavishly, and supporting a large family drained income faster than estates could generate it. By the time he died in 1606, the family owed thousands of pounds. His son, Lionel, inherited not just Knole, but a financial crisis that would take decades to resolve.
Lionel Sackville, 7th Earl of Dorset and 1st Duke of Dorset, inherited in 1706 at age 23. He was unprepared for the scale of the problem. His father, Charles, had been a literary figure and generous patron, but a poor financial manager. The debts were substantial. Estimates suggest £30,000 to £40,000, equivalent to several million pounds today. Annual income from estates was around £8,000. Interest on debts consumed perhaps £1,500 to £2,000 of that. Knole's operating costs took another £3,000 to £4,000. What remained barely covered basic expenses. Lionel took immediate action. He reduced staff, not dramatically but strategically. Positions that became vacant were not always filled. He cut back on entertainment. Weekend house parties became less frequent. He sold some art and furniture, pieces that were valuable but not essential to the family's identity. He renegotiated loans, consolidating debts at lower interest rates. It worked, slowly. Over 20 years, the debts shrank. By the late 1720s, the financial crisis had eased. Knole stabilized. But Lionel had learned something his father never fully grasped. Maintaining Knole meant sacrifice. It meant saying no to purchases, to expansion, to the impulse to display wealth as freely as his father had. Lionel was rewarded for his service to the crown. In 1720, he was elevated to Duke of Dorset, a rare honor. The title came with prestige, but no additional income. In fact, it increased expectations. Dukes were expected to live more grandly than earls. Lionel managed by being selective. He spent money on political patronage, which maintained influence, and on essential repairs at Knole. He did not spend on frivolities. He also married strategically. His wife, Elizabeth Collier, brought a substantial dowry and connections to influential families. They had children, several sons and daughters, which secured the succession but also increased expenses. Each child needed education, dowries for daughters, provisions for younger sons. The arithmetic never stopped. Lionel died in 1765 at age 75. He had held Knole for 59 years, longer than any previous earl. He had stabilized the estate financially, maintained the house, and passed it to his son in better condition than he'd inherited it. He had also learned what all his predecessors learned. Knole was never truly yours. You were its temporary custodian. It would outlast you. By the mid-18th century, Knole had been in Sackville hands for over 150 years. The house was reaching equilibrium, not growth, not decline, but a steady state maintained through constant effort. But external forces were shifting. England in the 1760s and 1770s faced new pressures: rising costs of war, the 7 Years' War,
conflict in the American colonies, increasing taxation, social changes as the middle class grew wealthier and more politically active. For aristocratic families like the Sackvilles, these forces meant adaptation or decline. The third Duke of Dorset, John Frederick Sackville, inherited in 1769. He was 42, unmarried, a diplomat who had served as British ambassador to France. He understood power and its performance. At Knole, he focused on maintaining appearances while controlling costs, a balance his father had mastered. But John Frederick also recognized something new, the idea of opening parts of Knole to public viewing. Not fully public, there was no admission fee, no formal tours, but selective access. Scholars, artists, and educated visitors could request permission to view the art collection, the library, the architecture. This was not charity, it was strategic. Showing Knole to influential visitors reinforced the family's cultural importance. It also cost almost nothing. By the 1770s, Knole received dozens of such visitors annually. They came with letters of introduction, were shown through select rooms by a servant, usually the housekeeper or a footman, and left with impressions that they shared in letters and publications. Horace Walpole visited in 1552 and described Knole as melancholy but magnificent. Artist Joshua Reynolds visited in the 1760s and sketched the architecture. These visits were controlled. Guests saw the Great Hall, the state bedrooms, the gallery. They did not see the service areas, the kitchens, the servants' quarters. The performance remained intact. The machinery stayed hidden. Beneath the stability, pressure continued to build. Not financial crisis, John Frederick managed the estate competently, but structural pressure. Knole required constant maintenance. Roofs needed repair every decade. Stonework needed repointing. Wood paneling needed refinishing. Textiles wore out and had to be replaced. The costs never stopped. And income from agricultural estates was increasingly unpredictable. Bad harvests meant lower rents. Economic downturns meant tenants struggling to pay. The house had survived religious upheaval, civil war, plague, fire — minor fires were common in houses with dozens of fireplaces — and political change. It had survived because each generation made a choice to maintain it. But how long could that continue? The question no one asked aloud: what happens when the cost of maintaining Knole exceeds the benefit of owning it?
John Frederick Sackville died in 1799 without direct heirs. The title and estate passed to a cousin, George John Frederick Sackville, who became the fourth Duke of Dorset. George inherited at age 23. He was wealthy by most standards, but Knole remained a burden. The late 18th and early 19th centuries brought new challenges. England was at war with France almost continuously from 1793 to 1815, the French Revolutionary Wars followed by the Napoleonic Wars. Taxes increased dramatically to fund the military. The first income tax in British history was introduced in 1799, taxing incomes over £60 at rates up to 10%. For aristocratic families, this was unprecedented. Wealth that had been largely untaxed was now subject to government extraction. Simultaneously, agricultural income declined. The war disrupted trade. Harvests fluctuated. Tenant farmers struggled. Rents, which had been the foundation of aristocratic wealth for centuries, became less reliable. Some estates that had generated £10,000 annually in the 1780s generated $7,000 or $8,000 in the 1800s. The difference compounded over years. At Knole, George faced a choice: maintain the house at current levels and accept declining savings, or reduce expenses significantly. He chose a middle path. He kept the core estate functional but reduced discretionary spending. Staff levels dropped slightly, not mass dismissals, but positions that became vacant were not always filled. He sold some art, though not major pieces. He rented out parts of the estate's farmlands to tenants who managed it themselves, reducing the need for estate-employed laborers. He also spent more time away from Knole. This was practical, not emotional. Maintaining a house in London was expensive, but London was where political and social power concentrated. If you weren't present, you lost influence. George kept apartments in London, visited Knole several times a year, but did not live there full time. The house became less a home and more a monument to be maintained.
His son, Charles Sackville, inherited in 1815. Charles was different. He had no interest in politics, no desire for social prominence. He wanted to live quietly at Knole, and he did for nearly 40 years. He married, had children, managed the estate conservatively. He made few changes. He didn't expand, didn't renovate significantly, didn't accumulate debt. He simply held the line. Under Charles, Knole reached perhaps its most stable period. The Napoleonic Wars had ended, agricultural income stabilized in the 1820s and 1830s. Taxes remained but became predictable. The house operated smoothly. Staff numbered around 60 to 70. Visitors came occasionally. The family lived comfortably but not extravagantly. But Charles also recognized that the world was changing. The Reform Act of 1832 expanded voting rights and reduced aristocratic control over Parliament. The rise of industrial wealth, factories, railroads, banking, created new fortunes that dwarfed traditional landed wealth. Aristocratic families who relied solely on agricultural income were slipping in relative status. Charles adapted quietly. He invested in railroad stocks, not heavily, but enough to diversify income. He leased some estate lands for industrial use, quarries, small factories when it made financial sense. He was not an entrepreneur, but he was not blind to reality. Knole needed more than agricultural rents to survive into the future. Charles died in 1843. His son, George, inherited. George held Knole for 20 years and made similar conservative choices. No major expansions, no dramatic changes, just steady maintenance. The house endured.
By the 1860s, Knole had been in Sackville hands for over 250 years. The house was a monument, but monuments require care, and care requires money. And money, by the late 19th century, was becoming a problem again. Mortimer Sackville-West, 1st Baron Sackville, inherited in 1876. Mortimer was a diplomat, like his ancestor John Frederick. He served as British minister to various countries, eventually becoming ambassador to the United States in the 1880s. He was rarely at Knole. The house was managed by stewards and housekeepers while Mortimer lived abroad. This absentee management created problems. Without the owner present, maintenance decisions were delayed. Repairs that should have been done immediately were postponed. Small problems became larger. The roof over the east wing developed leaks. Fixing it would have cost £500 in 1880. By 1888, when it was finally repaired, it cost £2,000 because water damage had rotted underlying timbers. Mortimer's children grew up mostly away from Knole. His daughter, Victoria, later wrote about visiting as a child and feeling that the house was haunted, not by ghosts, but by the weight of history. 365 rooms, most of them closed and unused, furniture covered in dust sheets, corridors where footsteps echoed. It was magnificent and melancholy, beautiful and oppressive. Mortimer died in 1888. His son, Lionel Sackville-West, 2nd Baron Sackville, inherited. Lionel had spent his career in diplomacy and had little interest in managing an estate. He considered selling Knole. The idea was not new. Previous generations had considered it, but now it seemed practical. The house was expensive, underused, and increasingly difficult to justify. But selling Knole meant abandoning 3 centuries of family identity. It meant admitting that the Sackvilles could no longer maintain what their ancestors had held. Lionel couldn't do it. Instead, he made a different choice. He would live at Knole, reduce expenses, and find a way to make it sustainable. He moved to Knole in 1890. He reduced staff to about 40, the lowest number in over a century. Entire wings were closed. The great hall, which had hosted hundreds of guests, was used only for family dinners and rare events. The stables, which had held 20 horses, held 5. The gardens, which had employed 10 gardeners, employed 3. The house felt empty, not abandoned, but diminished. The performance had ended. What remained was residence, a family living in rooms too large, surrounded by history too heavy.
Victoria Sackville-West, daughter of Lionel, wrote about Knole with a clarity that earlier generations lacked. In her memoir, she described the house as a beautiful corpse in the 1890s. It was magnificent. It was also dying, slowly, from lack of use and resources. But Victoria also loved Knole. She spent her childhood there, exploring corridors and courtyards, reading in the library, walking the deer park. She understood what the house represented, not just wealth, but history, continuity, a physical link to centuries of English life. Losing Knole would mean losing something irreplaceable. When her father died in 1908, Knole passed to her brother, Charles John Sackville-West, 4th Baron Sackville. Charles was 39, unmarried, without children. He was also the last male heir in the direct line. If he died without sons, the title and estate would pass to a distant cousin. The Sackville family's hold on Knole, which had lasted over 300 years, was fragile. Charles made a decision that shocked the family. He would donate Knole to the National Trust. The National Trust, founded in 1895, was a charitable organization dedicated to preserving historic buildings and landscapes. By the early 20th century, several aristocratic families had donated estates to the trust rather than see them sold or demolished. It was a way to ensure preservation while relieving the family of maintenance costs. Charles negotiated with the trust through the 1910s. The process was slow. The trust had limited resources and was cautious about taking on large properties with high maintenance costs, but Charles was persistent. He argued that Knole was nationally important, one of the finest examples of English domestic architecture with art and furniture collections of museum quality. Losing it would be a cultural disaster. The National Trust agreed in principle, but before the transfer could be completed, World War I began. The First World War changed everything. Not immediately at Knole. The house was too far from the front, too insulated by wealth and geography. But eventually, inevitably, the war reached inside even those walls. In 1914, Charles Sackville-West offered Knole to the War Office for use as a hospital. The offer was declined. There were hospitals closer to ports where wounded soldiers arrived. Instead, Knole continued as a residence, but a reduced one. Staff numbers dropped as men enlisted or were conscripted. By 1916, Knole employed fewer than 25 people, the lowest in its history. Entire wings were shut, furniture was covered, heating was reduced to save coal. The family lived in a handful of rooms, while the rest of the house sat cold and dark. The Great Hall, which had hosted kings and ambassadors, was used for storage. The state bedrooms, which had seen generations of guests, were empty. Charles died in 1928. He had never completed the transfer to the National Trust. The title and estate passed to his nephew, Charles Edward Sackville-West, 5th Baron Sackville. The new Charles, yes, another Charles, the name repeated through generations, was 51, unmarried, with no interest in preserving Knole as a family home.
He resumed negotiations with the National Trust. The terms were complex. The trust would take ownership of the house and primary collections, but the family would retain the right to live in certain rooms for 99 years. The family would also retain some income from the estate lands. It was not a gift. It was a negotiated survival. The transfer was completed in 1946, after World War II had ended and Britain had begun the slow process of recovery. Knole officially became National Trust property. The house opened to public tours. Visitors paid admission fees. The money went toward maintenance, roofs, stonework, conservation of textiles and furniture. The Sackville family retained apartments in one wing. They lived there quietly while tourists walked through the rest of the house. It was strange, necessary, melancholy. Vita Sackville-West, Victoria's daughter, wrote about Knole throughout her life. She had grown up there, loved it passionately, and was heartbroken when the family could no longer maintain it privately. She inherited nothing. As a woman, she could not inherit the title or entailed estates. Knole passed to male cousins. She wrote poems, novels, and essays about the house, about loss, about the passage of time. Her most famous work, The Edwardians, set at a fictionalized version of Knole, explores the hollow grandeur of aristocratic life. She understood what many visitors didn't. Knole was beautiful, yes. Knole was also a burden that had consumed generations. Maintaining it had required wealth, labor, and constant compromise. The house was not a fantasy. It was evidence of ambition, of power, of the costs hidden behind magnificence.
The money had to come from somewhere. That's the part most histories skip over. Thomas Sackville's wealth, the fortune that allowed him to renovate Knole and establish the family there, came primarily from his father's activities during the dissolution of the monasteries. Richard Sackville, Thomas's father, earned the nickname Phil Sack not through affection but through observation. He was a commissioner for the Crown during Henry VIII's seizure of Catholic Church properties in the 1530s and 40s. His job was to inventory monastery assets, assess their value, and oversee their transfer to royal control. He did this work efficiently. He also did it profitably. Commissioners were permitted to purchase confiscated lands at favorable rates. Richard Sackville purchased extensively. Monastery estates in Sussex and Kent, farmland that had generated income for religious orders for centuries, became Sackville property within a decade. This was legal. This was also extraction on a massive scale. The monks and nuns who had lived on and worked those lands for generations were expelled. Tenant farmers who had rented from the church suddenly rented from the Sackvilles. The income stream didn't disappear, it simply changed hands. What had supported religious communities now supported a single family. Thomas Sackville inherited this wealth. He didn't create it. He didn't question it. He used it to serve the crown, to write poetry, to renovate Knole. The foundation of everything that followed, 400 years of Sackville occupation, rested on that original appropriation. This doesn't make Thomas Sackville uniquely evil. Half the aristocratic families in England built wealth the same way. The dissolution redistributed roughly 1/5 of England's land from the church to private hands between 1536 and 1541. Men like Richard Sackville were instruments of that redistribution. They profited, yes, but they were also executing crown policy, operating within the legal and moral framework of their time. Still, the money came from somewhere. Knole was maintained for centuries on income that originated in seizure, displacement, and the transfer of communal religious property to private family control. The house itself, built originally by an archbishop, became the property of people who had benefited from dismantling the system that created it. By the 20th century, that original sin had long been forgotten or rationalized. What remained was the burden. A house too large, costs too high, income insufficient. The Sackville family had become custodians of something they could no longer truly afford. The transformation from private home to national trust property in 1946 was not a gift, it was a negotiated surrender. The family retained the right to live in portions of the house, but gave up ownership, gave up control, gave up the fantasy that Knole could remain what it had been for 3 centuries. What did that surrender mean? For the family, relief, certainly. No more impossible choices between maintaining the house and maintaining solvency. No more mortgaging future generations to preserve the past, but also loss. Loss of privacy. Tourists now walked through rooms that had been private for centuries. Loss of control. The National Trust decided what to restore, what to display, how to tell the story. Loss of identity. The Sackvilles were no longer the owners of Knole, merely its residents. For the house, a transformation into museum.
Rooms that had been lived in became exhibits. Furniture that had been used became artifacts behind ropes. The performance that had been for guests, weekend house parties, dinners, the social theater of aristocratic life, became a performance for strangers paying admission. And for the public, access. For the first time in Knole's 500-year history, ordinary people could walk through the Great Hall, climb the staircases, see the collections. No longer was this a space reserved for aristocrats and their guests. It became democratized, opened, shared. But something was lost in that opening too. The house became sanitized. The tours emphasized beauty, history, cultural achievement. They mentioned servants, yes, modern National Trust tours discuss labor, but the emphasis remained on grandeur. The darker questions about where wealth came from, who paid the real costs, whether such concentration of resources in private hands was ever justified, those questions were harder to address in 45-minute tours. Knole became heritage, safe, educational, picturesque, the rough edges smoothed, the contradictions managed.
What does Knole reveal about inheritance itself? Not just inheriting property, but inheriting systems, structures, moral frameworks. Every generation of Sackvilles inherited not just a house, but a worldview. The assumption that aristocratic families deserved vast estates because their ancestors had acquired them. The assumption that hierarchy was natural, some born to serve, others born to be served. The assumption that beauty and culture justified the extraction required to create them. Most of them never questioned these assumptions. They were born into them, raised within them, operated by them without conscious thought. Thomas Sackville in 1603 no more questioned the morality of aristocratic privilege than he questioned gravity. It was simply how the world worked. But by the 20th century, those assumptions were crumbling. 2 world wars demonstrated that aristocratic leadership wasn't inherently superior. The rise of democracy challenged inherited political power. The growth of the middle class created new forms of wealth and influence that didn't depend on land ownership. The old system was dying. The Sackvilles adapted. They negotiated with modernity rather than resisting it entirely. They reduced staff, closed wings, eventually transferred ownership. They survived by compromising, by accepting that Knole could not remain a private palace in a world that no longer supported such things. Other families didn't adapt. Hundreds of English country houses were demolished in the 20th century, too expensive to maintain, too difficult to sell, easier to destroy and develop the land. The Sackvilles chose preservation over destruction. That choice cost them ownership, but it saved the house. Was that the right choice? It depends on what you value. If you value cultural preservation, maintaining architecture, art, history for future generations, then yes. If you question whether such houses should ever have existed, whether they represent systems that should be celebrated or critiqued, then the answer becomes more complicated. Knole exists now as both monument and evidence. Monument to English architectural achievement, to centuries of artistic patronage, to skilled craftsmanship. Evidence of how aristocratic power functioned, how wealth concentrated, how labor was organized to serve private luxury. Both are true. Both matter. The deer park at Knole covers roughly 1,000 acres. It has existed since the 15th century, when Archbishop Bourchier enclosed the land for hunting. Deer have grazed there for over 500 years. Fallow deer, with their distinctive spotted coats, browsing among ancient oaks. The park is now open to the public. Free access, no admission charge. People walk dogs, jog, picnic under trees that were saplings when Shakespeare was alive. The deer remain, semi-wild, accustomed to humans, but not tame. This is what transformation looks like. Land that was private for centuries, reserved for aristocrats and their guests, enclosed by walls and rules, is now common space. The walls remain, but the gates stay open. What was exclusive became inclusive.
The same logic applied to the house. Rooms that only aristocrats and their carefully selected guests could enter are now accessible to anyone who pays the modest admission fee. The Great Hall, where earls dined and kings visited, hosts school groups on Tuesday mornings. The state bedrooms, where ambassadors slept, are photographed by tourists from around the world. Is this progress? In one sense, clearly yes. Democratizing access to beauty and history is valuable. People who would never have been allowed past the gatehouse in 1700 now can stand in the same rooms, see the same ceilings, touch, carefully, the same furniture. But something is also lost. The house was designed for private use. Its scale, its architecture, its decoration, all served specific functions within a specific social system. Removing that system and preserving only the physical shell changes meaning. Knole as a lived aristocratic home was one thing. Knole as a museum is something else. Neither is pure. Neither is simple. The aristocratic home was beautiful and oppressive. The museum is accessible and sanitized. Both versions of Knole tell partial truths.
Vida Sackville-West wrote about Knole with a longing that bordered on obsession. She was born there in 1892, grew up wandering its corridors and courtyards, absorbed its atmosphere as part of her identity. When she couldn't inherit, when the house passed to male cousins because she was female, the loss consumed her. She wrote novels set at fictionalized versions of Knole. She wrote poems about the house. She wrote a family history, Knole and the Sackvilles, that mixed memoir and research. She returned to visit whenever possible, walking the rooms that had been hers and were no longer. Her grief was real, but it was also complicated. Vida understood, intellectually, that the aristocratic system was dying. She was politically left-leaning, sympathetic to socialism, critical of inherited privilege in the abstract. But Knole was not abstract. It was stone and wood and memory. Losing it meant losing part of herself. This contradiction, loving what you intellectually question, runs through Vita's writing about Knole. She could acknowledge that the house represented a system she opposed while still mourning her exclusion from it. She could understand that concentration of wealth in private hands was unjust, while still feeling that this particular house should have been hers. Human nature resists consistency. We can hold contradictory truths. The system was wrong, but I loved this beautiful thing the system created. Knole should be open to everyone, but I wish it were still mine. Vita's response was to create her own Knole. At Sissinghurst Castle in Kent, she and her husband Harold Nicholson designed gardens that became world famous. She couldn't have Knole, so she made something new, still beautiful, still ambitious, but hers. Sissinghurst became another National Trust property after her death. The pattern repeated: private creation, public inheritance.
Today, Knole receives approximately 200,000 visitors annually. They come to see the architecture, the furniture, the paintings. They come because it's National Trust, because it's historic, because it's beautiful. Some come because they've read Vida Sackville-West. Some come because they're researching family history, distant Sackville relatives, former servants whose descendants want to know where their ancestors worked. The visitors walk predetermined routes: the ground floor, the showrooms, the galleries. They don't see the closed wings, the family apartments where Sackvilles still live, the service corridors now used for storage and staff offices. They see a curated version of Knole, the parts deemed suitable for public viewing. The National Trust has struggled with how to tell Knole's story. For decades, the narrative emphasized grandeur and cultural achievement. Recent years have brought change, more discussion of servants, of social hierarchy, of the systems that made such houses possible. But change is slow. Donors and visitors often prefer celebration to critique. Heritage tourism sells beauty and history, not moral complexity. What questions should Knole force us to ask? Here are some. When we preserve great houses, what are we preserving? Just architecture and art, or also the systems that created them? Can you separate beauty from the conditions that produced it? Should you? Who benefits from preservation? Tourists, certainly, scholars and students, the national trust and local economies, but do the descendants of servants benefit? Do the communities whose wealth was extracted to build and maintain these places? Should houses like Knole exist at all? Not now, they already exist and destroying them would eliminate history, but should they have existed? Was the concentration of resources they represented ever justifiable?
These are not rhetorical questions. They're real. They deserve real thought, not easy answers. The mansion is a mirror. What we see depends on what we look for. If you look for beauty, you'll find it. Stunning architecture, priceless art, magnificent craftsmanship. If you look for injustice, you'll find that too. Extraction, hierarchy, labor unrewarded. Both exist. Both are true. The challenge is holding both truths simultaneously without flattening complexity into simple judgment. Knole stands. The stone endures, patient and indifferent. Winter light falls through mullioned windows, casting shadows that have fallen for 5 centuries. The courtyards are quiet except for footsteps. Tourists in summer, maintenance workers in winter, always someone moving through spaces built for different purposes. The house has outlasted the archbishops who built it, the monarchs who seized it, the aristocrats who occupied it. It will outlast us, too. What we make of it, what stories we tell, what questions we ask, what truths we're willing to see, that's temporary. The stone remains. Stand in the great hall one more time. Look up, 40 feet to the ceiling. Wooden beams, carved and aged. The scale was meant to overwhelm, to remind visitors of their place in a hierarchy that stretched from God through kings to nobles to commoners. The architecture was theology and politics made physical. That hierarchy is gone. The system that built Knole and houses like it collapsed over decades, eroded by wars and taxes and social change. What remains is the shell, beautiful, empty of original purpose, filled now with new meanings. The house stands, the questions remain. What we do with both is up to us.